now we come to the heart of the matter. Are we in Cold War II, do you think?
If you ask Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, he gave a speech about a month ago outlining their technology strategy. For a long time, the U.S. Approach to semiconductors was to make sure that any adversary was 2 generations behind, similar to the 5 years that Morris Chang told you about. And as of 1 month ago, the approach is different. Per Sullivan's speech, now we're trying to increase the gap between the U.S. and China, partly by CHIPS Act funding, hopefully accelerating development in the U.S., but perhaps more importantly, by stopping China from moving forward. So now there's no ambiguity in U.S. government policy. Our goal is to stop semiconductor advances in China, thereby to stop the rollout of advanced AI in China, and to make sure that all of it happens offshore of China.
So this is a fascinating phenomenon, that the administration is essentially pursuing a kind of Cold War strategy, but it just doesn't like using the words cold and war. But even the New York Times had a piece just a couple of weeks ago saying, it kind of feels like a Cold War. And I'm trying to think what the implications are of this second Cold War, thank you very much, in the sense that we're up against a more economically and technologically formidable opponent. I mean, the Chinese economy is already on a purchasing power parity basis, the same size or larger than the US economy, whereas the Soviet economy was never more than about 40% the size. So it's clearly an economically more formidable rival. And as you've shown in your book, they're a lot closer in terms of this kind of technology than the Soviets were able to be, in that we're actively having to work to stop them catching up. And I just wonder where this goes. Let me try an analogy out on you that our old friend at Harvard, Graham Allison, wrote about not so long ago. And that's not a Cold War analogy, it's a World War analogy. And essentially, Graham Allison argued in a piece that I think was in National Review, we're in danger of doing to China now what we did to Japan in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there were different commercial sanctions imposed on Japan. Japan was cut off from oil, and that ultimately led to the extraordinarily risky and disastrous attack on Pearl Harbor. And I think Graham was arguing that there's a danger something similar happens here, where we so constrain China, we essentially say, you cannot catch up. You're not going to catch up. We're going to freeze you, not just 5 years behind, but maybe 10 years behind. Isn't the danger that China then concludes, well, in that case, we have to invade Taiwan. That's actually our only solution. I've certainly seen that written by some Chinese bloggers, not from the government side, but that's not being censored in China as you'd expect it to be if it was clearly unwelcome in Beijing. Is there a danger in your mind that Cold War II actually ends up being World War III?
I think that is a risk. I think there are risks on both sides of the equation. There's a risk that excessive controls right now make Beijing take risky moves in the way that you've outlined. There's also a risk in not taking efforts to restrain China's access to computing power, and thereby seeing the military balance shift even more. And I think it's just worth thinking about how dramatically the military balance has already shifted. I like thinking back to the 1995-1996 Taiwan Straits crisis, when the Chinese shot a couple of missiles over Taiwan, and then Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, ordered 2 aircraft carriers to sail around Taiwan, one of them transiting through the Taiwan Straits. That would never happen today, because the risk to the carrier would be too severe. The question now is not, can we sail a carrier through the Taiwan Straits? It's, can we operate one in the Western Pacific, given the long range and high accuracy of Chinese missiles? I mean, now we're talking about a war with China involving strikes on U.S. bases in Guam, all across Japan. Chinese capabilities are far, far advanced compared to where they were even 10 years ago, and they're going to advance further over the next 5 or 10 years in terms of number of systems produced, and catch up by that metric. So the only hope we have of slowing down the deterioration of our military position is by slowing down Chinese advances, and that's what the Biden administration is betting is the greater risk than the risk that Graham Allison sketched out. I would give you one other difference with with Japan in 1939, 1940, 1941, when the Roosevelt administration was increasing its sanctions on Japan. The export controls on China that the Biden administration has laid out are sweeping in some ways, but they're targeted in others. They're sweeping in that they are an effort to call to a complete halt to China's advances, but they do nothing to target any Chinese chip activities beyond the cutting edge. So anything that is not technologically advanced, going into low-tech consumer devices, for example, all that remains untouched, and China still has the capacity to roll out its capabilities there. It's only the cutting edge that's being targeted. Whereas the sanctions on Japan, it's worth remembering, were on oil, not just advanced oil, all oil. And so it had ramifications not just for the Japanese Navy, but for Japanese automobiles as well. So I think that is an important difference to draw out. But yes, the risk is real. It's a risk that I worry about.
And it seems to me odd that of those sophisticated cutting edge semiconductors, 90+% are manufactured on an island that China claims belongs to it. Surely the simple solution for China is to invade and take over and then own TSMC. Is that a viable option? Could they do that?
If by invade we're thinking a D-Day style invasion, I think the answer is no. The facilities wouldn't survive an invasion, both because semiconductor fabs have lots of explosive chemicals inside, coupled with the most precise machinery in human history. This is perfectly designed not to survive a war. And because the Taiwanese would probably blow them up, and because if they didn't, the US would probably blow them up. And even if they were intact, you'd still need all of the TSMC staff to keep working there, none of them sabotaging, all of them trying to keep producing chips. And even then, you still need US tools and Japanese tools and chemicals and software updates from abroad. I think it's highly implausible, approaching a 0% probability that China could succeed in invading and grabbing TSMC facilities. What I worry about more is, as the US military position gets weaker and weaker every year, Taiwan's confidence in our ability to come to their aid declines year after year, and China's ability to pressure Taiwan in scenarios between peace and war grows. For example, grabbing one of the offshore islands and challenging the US. Do we intervene? Do we not intervene? Or imposing customs checks on 5% of the ships going into Taipei Harbor. Is that a blockade or is that a quarantine? Is that something that Biden would be willing to risk World War III over or not? And the moment that China has some sort of success in this sort of salami slicing away of Taiwan's sovereignty is the moment that the Taiwanese look at their military defense plans, all of which are predicated on giving the US enough time to come to the rescue. And if the Taiwanese start to think we're not going to be able to come to the rescue, or not willing to come to the rescue, then fighting for their sovereignty becomes a hopeless task, in which case China could follow up and say, by the way, we'd like to have more access to TSMC's facilities. And Taiwan could, in a couple of years' time, find itself in a position where it feels unsafe to say no. And that's why there's a deep relationship between our military power, dwindling though it is in the Asia-Pacific region, and control or access to TSMC's shipping facilities.
This